The air in the Ozark Mountains had a peculiar density in the late autumn of 1907. It wasn't just the chill that clung to the valleys, it was the weight of the isolation, the kind that pressed down on the few scattered homesteads like a coffin lid. For young Elias Vance, a photographer newly arrived from St. Louis, the journey to the small, unnamed settlement had been an exercise in bone-jarring solitude. He was a man with a keen eye for detail, a professional who specialized in the morbidly fashionable craft of post-mortem photography, and his latest and most unusual commission had brought him here deep into the woods to the estate of the Langley family. The Langley property, when Elias finally crested the ridge, was not what he expected. It wasn't the decaying shack of mountain lore, but a two-story farmhouse, austere and well-kept, surrounded by acres of cleared, overworked land. Yet an unnatural quiet lay over the place. The only sound was the rhythmic, mournful creak of a distant windmill and the scrape of Elias's boots on the gravel path. He was met at the porch by Silas Langley, the patriarch. Silas was a man sculpted by granite and sun-scorched patience. His eyes, the color of muddy river water, held a profound exhaustion, but they also contained a flickering, almost frantic anxiety that contradicted his stern posture. He wore clean but worn overalls and a distrust that was palpable. "You're late," Silas stated, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that carried the accent of the deep hills. Elias adjusted his worn leather satchel, containing his camera, tripod, and a precious stock of glass plates. "The roads from Lebanon are near impassable, Mr. Langley. It's late in the season. I made the best time I could." Silas barely nodded. Time waits for no man, especially not when a body's waiting. "Come in." The rest of the family, they've been waiting. The interior of the house was stifling, the air heavy with the scent of pine smoke, dried herbs, and an indefinable metallic tang that Elias suspected was the faint, lingering smell of death. The room, furnished with heavy hand-carved oak, was lit only by a pair of flickering oil lamps. The shadows, long and dancing, made the corners seem vast and unknowable. In the center of the room, on a simple cot, lay the subject of Elias's work, Esther Langley, Silas's youngest daughter. She was merely 12, her skin a waxy pale, but her face was serene, framed by a lace cap. The family, Silas's wife Martha, and their two elder children, Jedediah and Rebecca, stood stiffly around the cot. They were a tableau of grief, yet it was a strangely contained grief, rigid and silent. Martha, a woman with a face etched by worry, wrung her hands. Her eyes darted from Elias to the cot and back, a silent plea for discretion and speed. Jedediah, a gaunt young man with a nervous tick near his eye, stood behind his mother, leaning heavily on the wall. Rebecca, perhaps the most unsettling of the group, was a woman in her 20s whose face was utterly blank, an empty canvas of emotion. She held a doll, Esther's doll, Elias assumed, and simply stared into the middle distance. "The arrangement is simple, Mr. Vance," Silas said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You'll take the photograph, a proper family portrait. Esther will be seated as if she were merely resting. No signs of distress." "I understand," Elias said, already setting up his heavy wooden camera. He knew the conventions of the trade, the deception of life in death. "But Mr. Langley, your telegram mentioned a second matter. Something about a photograph already taken?" At that, a sharp collective intake of breath filled the room. Martha looked away, her lips trembling. Jedediah shifted his weight nervously. Silas's muddy eyes hardened instantly, the anxiety replaced by a controlled, chilling fury. "That," Silas hissed, leaning close enough for Elias to smell the wood smoke on his clothes, "is not for discussion while the work is underway. Finish your job. We will discuss the other matter when Esther is preserved." Elias, despite the cold weight of the camera on his shoulder, felt a prickle of genuine dread. This wasn't simple grief. It was concealment. He began his work, carefully positioning the cot and the heavy tripod. He asked Martha to position Esther as they wished her to appear. As Martha gently moved her daughter's rigid limbs, she whispered something Elias couldn't quite catch, something that sounded less like an endearment and more like a plea for forgiveness. As he focused the lens, the room seemed to shrink, the silence amplifying the click of the shutter and the faint metallic scent. The Langley family gathered around the child, a perfect picture of somber, early-century grief. Only Rebecca remained distant, still staring, but now her lips were moving silently, as if arguing with the doll in her arms. Elias removed the dark cloth from his head. "It is done. I will develop the plate now." Silas watched him with the intensity of a predator. "You will develop it here, in the root cellar, and you will not leave this property until we have an understanding about what the first man did." Elias nodded, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The first man. The previous photographer. Why was his work so critical, and what horrible secret was contained within that hidden image? As he followed Silas to the dark earthen cellar, Elias knew he hadn't just taken a photo. He had walked into a trap of silence and shame, where the true nature of Esther's death and the photo that preceded it was buried deep beneath the Ozarks soil. Thank you for watching the first chapter of the horrible story of the Macabre Langley family and the post-mortem photo they hid. If you're gripped by the mystery of the Ozarks and the Langley family's dark secret, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so you don't miss the next chapter. What do you think the first photographer saw? Let us know in the comments below. The root cellar smelled of damp soil, rotting potatoes, and fear. Elias, the photographer, descended the rickety wooden steps, his heavy camera equipment clanking against the rough-hewn walls. Silas Langley followed, the beam of his kerosene lantern casting huge, distorted shadows that danced like vengeful spirits. The air was colder down here, clinging to the skin like a shroud. "The light's poor," Elias muttered, setting his gear down on a rough wooden crate. "Developing a glass plate requires precise chemical control and proper exposure, Mr. Langley. I'll need more light than this." "You'll use the light I provide," Silas stated, his tone brooking no argument. He set the lantern on the dirt floor, illuminating the small area with a weak, yellowish glow. The light barely reached the corners, where barrels of salted meat and shelves of preserves waited in the oppressive darkness. "No need for a full reveal, Mr. Vance, just enough for you to work." Elias realized the constraint wasn't about conserving oil, it was about control. Silas wanted to ensure Elias saw nothing but the chemicals and the plate. Working quickly, his hands steady despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach, Elias began the process. He mixed the developer, the fixer, and the water, each movement precise, each measurement committed to memory. The silence was absolute, broken only by the slosh of liquids and the distant, mournful wind outside. Silas stood rigid, his shadow immense on the earthen wall, watching every minuscule action. "You haven't told me about the first photographer," Elias ventured, needing to break the suffocating silence. Silas exhaled slowly. "Man named Titus Baines, a peddler mostly. Took up the camera for quick coin. He came through here maybe 4 weeks ago before Esther took ill." "He took a photo of Esther before she died?" "No," Silas corrected, his voice low and guttural. "He took the required photo, just like you. The post-mortem one. But then, he developed a second plate. An unauthorized plate." Elias dipped the glass negative from the session into the developer tray. The emulsion, initially opaque, began to reveal the somber outlines of the Langley family gathered around the deceased child. "And what did this unauthorized photo show?" Silas paused and Elias watched the tension coil in the man's powerful frame. "It showed what we didn't want seen." He claimed it was an error, an overexposure, a shadow. "What was it, Mr. Langley?" Elias pressed, the mystery now demanding his full attention. "It was Martha," Silas said, the name a venomous hiss. He claimed the developed image showed Martha doing something unnatural. He demanded money to destroy the plate and the print. Blackmail, Elias concluded, a wave of cold realization washing over him. The family wasn't hiding a secret about Esther's death. They were hiding a secret about Martha that the photograph threatened to expose. Did you pay him? Silas gave a harsh, humorless laugh. We're not rich men, Mr. Vance. We gave him what we could, but he was greedy. He left with a threat to display the image in the nearest town, to ruin us. We chased him. We tried to recover it. And did you? Elias asked, pulling the first plate from the developer and slipping it into the fixer. The image of the composed family portrait was now clear, sharp, and hauntingly beautiful. Silas's eyes, fixed on the developed plate, seemed to sink deeper into his skull. He didn't answer immediately. He walked to a corner of the cellar, and his hand rested on a heavy, dusty spade propped against the wall. Titus Baines, Silas finally said, turning back, his face unreadable in the poor light. Never made it to the next town. His wagon was found abandoned near the creek 3 weeks past. The man himself, gone. But the plate, the evidence he used for his wickedness, that's the only thing that matters. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cellar. Baines had been blackmailed, pursued, and had vanished. The implication was stark and unavoidable. This was no longer just about a photograph. It was about a desperate act of violence. And you believe he hid the negative? Elias asked, meticulously washing his own plate in a bucket of cold water. We know he did. A new voice cut through the silence. It was Jedediah standing halfway up the steps, his nervous tick working furiously. We found his ledger. He logged the plate number. He hid it somewhere near the creek. We've been looking for weeks every day. Silas shot Jedediah a look that would curdle milk, a clear warning about speaking too much. And why involve me? Elias pressed, wiping his hands on a rag. You have your portrait, the one I just took. My work is done. No, your work is not done, Silas said, stepping forward, his large frame blocking the path to the stairs. The spade was now an ominous, silent presence between them. Baines was a photographer. You are a photographer. You know where a man like that would hide his most valuable secret. You know the darkroom logic. You know his tricks. You will stay until you help us find that plate. Elias stared into the menacing depth of Silas's eyes. He was a captive. The only way out was to find the thing they feared most, the photographic evidence that implicated Martha in some heinous, desperate act. And if I refuse? Elias asked, trying to sound calmer than he felt. Silas smiled then, a brief, horrifying grimace. Then you'll join Titus Baines in the dark. We have enough problems with strangers passing through. You'll understand, Mr. Vance. Family must protect its own. Now tomorrow we ride to the creek. You'll show us where to dig. Elias looked down at his own finished portrait of Esther and the family. The composure was a lie. The stillness was a pretense. He had captured the surface of a family, but the darkness lurking beneath, captured by a predecessor, was what truly held the key to the horror of the Langley house. He was now an unwilling detective in a crime that was growing colder with every minute, buried beneath the indifferent soil of the Ozarks. The dawn broke cold and gray over the Ozark hills, painting the forest in hues of muted slate and brown. Elias hadn't slept. He lay awake on a thin cot in the small, unused study, listening to the house creak, every groan of the wood sounding like a stifled sob. The air upstairs, unlike the cellar, was heavy with the presence of the living, and the uneasy silence of the Langleys was more terrifying than any scream. Before the sun was fully up, Silas and Jedediah were waiting for him, two figures of grim determination, saddling two old, sway-backed horses. Elias mounted the third, his bag containing the portrait and the developing tools strapped tight. Rebecca will stay with Ma, Silas instructed, his breath misting in the frigid air. She keeps an eye on things. Elias glanced toward the house. Rebecca stood in the doorway, the oversized doll still clutched to her chest, her vacant stare fixed not on them, but on the dark woods beyond. There was something profoundly disturbing about her detachment, an emotional wound that seemed wider and deeper than mere grief for her sister. The ride was grueling. They followed a barely visible game trail, descending into a deep, rocky hollow where the wind was cut by the steep banks. The creek was a sluggish, cold ribbon of water, choked with dead leaves and scattered rocks. "Baines's wagon was here," Silas announced, pointing to a small, cleared area by the bank. "We found it overturned. It looked like he was in a hurry. Tried to hide something, maybe." Elias dismounted, surveying the scene. The ground was littered with broken glass, probably from Baines's unused plates, and a scattering of cheap, mass-produced buttons, the kind found on traveling salesmen's coats. "You said he kept a ledger. Did he indicate a specific hiding spot?" Elias asked. Jedediah, visibly nervous, checked his surroundings constantly. He wrote down the plate number, and then a line. It said, "The eye of the juniper sees what the lens captured." Elias frowned. The language was deliberately cryptic, a dramatic flourish common among men who saw themselves as artists or secret keepers. "The eye of the juniper." That suggests a knothole, or a specific shape in a tree, perhaps one facing the creek. They began a systematic search of the immediate area. Silas, armed with a powerful axe, began testing the trunks of old junipers, listening for a hollow sound. Jedediah scanned the ground, digging with a small trowel in any disturbed patch of earth. Elias, however, focused on the photographer's perspective. Baines wouldn't hide his leverage in a random spot. He'd choose a secure, memorable location that only he could interpret, tied to the scene of the crime, or his escape. He walked to the creek's edge and looked back toward where the wagon had been. The eye of the juniper sees what the lens captured. What did the lens capture? The scene. The place where he was ambushed, or where he decided to hide the plate. Elias knelt down by the water and examined the bank. The soil here was wetter, looser. He noticed a cluster of 3 smooth river stones, unnaturally arranged in a small triangle. They looked like an arrow, subtly pointing up the bank. Following the direction, Elias walked 20 feet uphill, past the overturned wagon site, and stopped at a massive, ancient juniper. It was a gnarled, twisted thing, its bark a fortress of gray and brown. And there it was, a large, dark knothole near the base, about the size of a man's fist, perfectly positioned to stare out across the creek. "The eye." "Silas," Elias called out. "Over here, the juniper with the knothole." Silas and Jedediah abandoned their searching and rushed over. Silas's eyes, usually dull, now shone with a feverish intensity. Elias reached toward the hole, but Silas shoved him aside. "Stand back." Silas plunged his hand into the dark opening. He grunted, his fingers scraping the bark, and after a moment of frantic searching, he pulled out a small, tightly wrapped parcel, secured with twine and wrapped in oilcloth. A primitive waterproof seal. The tension was suffocating. Jedediah was breathing in ragged gasps. Silas's hands were shaking as he fumbled with the twine, finally ripping the cloth away to reveal a single, pristine glass plate, negative. The crucial evidence. The family's downfall. Silas held the negative up to the pale morning light, his face contorted in a mixture of relief and absolute dread. The image, still faint and reversed, was undeniably clear. It was a post-mortem photograph of Esther, similar to the one Elias had taken, with the family surrounding her. But the details were horrifyingly different. Martha was in the foreground, and her hands were not simply resting on the child. In the captured moment, the image showed her pressing a cloth, a thick, wet cloth, over Esther's face. The child's arm, stiff in death, was positioned in a slight upward arc, which, in the context of the photo, looked like a desperate final struggle. The scene wasn't just grieving, it was staged. "The wicked liar," Silas roared, his voice echoing off the banks. "It's a lie. He doctored it. It's a cruel, wicked slander." But the raw, primal terror in his eyes told Elias the truth. The photo wasn't doctored. It showed an act of suffocation. Martha Langley, the mother, had deliberately ended her daughter's life. Jedediah saw it too. His already pale face turned ashen, and he stumbled backward, clutching his stomach. Ma, she wouldn't." Silas, moving with terrifying speed, lifted the heavy axe from his shoulder. He slammed the blunt end down on a large, flat rock, smashing the glass plate into 1,000 glittering shards. The sound was deafening, a final, violent end to the evidence. "It never existed," Silas screamed, his eyes wild. "It was never taken. Now, we go home and we speak of this to no one. No one, Vance, not a soul." Elias looked from the pulverized glass to the horrified Jedediah, and then to the maniacal, desperate Silas. He had found the plate, but in doing so, he had confirmed a murder and sealed his fate as a keeper of the secret. The price of his freedom had just risen exponentially. He had to escape, not just from the Langleys, but from the truth he now carried. The journey back to the farmhouse was conducted in a chilling silence, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Elias kept a wary distance from Silas, whose rage had subsided into a cold, terrifying control. Jedediah lagged behind, his body slumped, his face betraying the trauma of what he had witnessed on the shattered glass plate. The confirmation of his mother's unimaginable act had broken the young man's nervous spirit. Elias's mind raced. He now understood the full scope of the Langleys' terror. It wasn't just fear of being ruined by gossip, it was fear of the gallows. Martha, the quiet, worried mother, was a murderer. Esther, the subject of the post-mortem photo, was a victim of familial violence. They returned to the house. The atmosphere inside was heavier than before, thick with an unspoken guilt that now included Elias. Silas led Elias into the parlor, where Martha was tending the fire, her back to them. "Martha," Silas said, his voice unusually gentle, "the matter is settled. The photographer was successful. The lie has been destroyed." Martha turned, and Elias saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not relief, but a crushing, weary acceptance. She looked at Elias, a gaze of profound resignation. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "Now we can finally mourn." The sheer audacity of the lie chilled Elias to the core. They were acting as if nothing had happened, as if the truth they had just destroyed at the creek didn't exist. "Silas," Jedediah stammered from the doorway, his eyes fixed on the floor. I don't feel well. I need to be alone." "Go," Silas ordered, his tone stern. "Rest, and remember what you've sworn. Silence." Jedediah scurried up the stairs. Rebecca, who had been sitting in the corner still gripping her doll, watched him go with that unnervingly blank expression. Elias was left alone with Silas and Martha, the three of them locked in a grim, silent pact. "You have the portrait," Elias began, his voice firm, trying to reclaim some authority. "My work is done. I require payment and passage back to St. Louis." Silas walked to the mantelpiece and pulled a small, heavy leather pouch from a concealed nook. He tossed it onto the table. The metallic clink of coins was the only sound. "Payment is there," Silas said, a menacing undertone lacing his words. "Passage is not yet available." "I don't understand," Elias said, deliberately reaching for the pouch but not taking it. "The roads are clear enough for me to leave." "The roads are fine," Silas conceded. "But you know too much, Mr. Vance. That photo at the creek, even its memory, is a liability. Titus Baines learned that lesson the hard way. He had the nerve to threaten us. You, on the other hand, are an educated man. You understand leverage. You think I would use this to extort you?" Elias challenged, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "I think you are a man of the world." Silas replied, his face impassive. And men of the world talk. They talk to lawmen. They talk to newspapers. We cannot risk that. You will stay until we decide the coast is clear. The implication was clear. Elias was an involuntary guest, a prisoner. And how long will that be? Until we decide you have accepted the family's grief as truth, Martha interjected softly, her voice carrying a profound, unsettling finality. She looked directly at Elias, and in her eyes he saw a complex mix of guilt, protection, and a deep, crushing sorrow. She hadn't murdered Esther out of malice. She had done it out of some desperate personal necessity. But what? Elias needed a plan. He needed to understand the motive. The family's actions were driven not just by murder, but by a deeper, more agonizing secret that Esther's life, or death, had somehow resolved. He tried to gather information. What did Esther die of, Mrs. Langley? Was she ill? Martha's hands tightened. A fever, a terrible, wasting fever. She suffered, Mr. Vance. She suffered terribly. And the town doctor, did he examine her? We are far from town, Silas cut in sharply, and we require no outsider meddling in our affairs. Now you will take your meal and stay in the study. You will not approach the barn. You will not leave the house. We will watch you. Elias knew any attempt to leave now would be met with violence. He had to play the part of the compliant prisoner, all while searching for the key to their deep-seated motive. That evening, during the sparse dinner, the silence at the table was oppressive. Jedediah refused to look up. Rebecca continued to stare vacantly, occasionally feeding the doll scraps of food. It was Rebecca's strange behavior that finally drew Elias's attention. He saw her gently rock the doll, whispering a lullaby, a melody that sounded ancient and desolate. Then he noticed the doll's clothes. They were the same style, material, and color as Esther's dress, a homemade replica. But what truly struck him was the way Rebecca held the doll. She positioned it not in a loving, childish embrace, but in a rigid, defensive position, the doll's face pressed hard against her own chest, as if she were trying to smother it, or trying to prevent it from being seen. Elias realized that the family's secret might not be contained solely by the parents, but by the other children as well. Jedediah was broken by the knowledge. Rebecca was processing the murder in a twisted, non-verbal performance. She wasn't just grieving for her sister, she was reenacting something, perhaps reflecting the deep-seated psychological trauma of her sister's forced passing and the underlying horror that necessitated it. The psychological pressure in the house was a palpable force, slowly suffocating Elias. He was surrounded by a murderer, a conspirator, a witness in deep shock, and a sister lost to delusion. The hidden truth was still incomplete. Why did Martha kill her daughter? The answer had to be somewhere in the house, hidden not in the soil, but in the complex, fractured minds of the Langley family. Elias knew his imprisonment was not a short-term issue. Silas Langley was not a man of impulsive violence. He was a man of calculated, desperate survival. To escape, Elias needed not only an opportunity but a distraction, something that would momentarily shatter Silas's control. His attention returned to Rebecca. Her constant, unsettling presence was a loose thread in the family's tapestry of lies. If Jedediah was tormented by the secret, Rebecca seemed lost within it, a silent, disturbed witness. The next morning, while Silas was busy checking his traps and Jedediah was locked away in his room, Elias found Martha in the kitchen, churning butter with a listless, mechanical rhythm. Rebecca was, as always, nearby, sitting on a low stool by the hearth, whispering to her doll. Elias approached Martha cautiously. "Mrs. Langley, I saw the plate at the creek. I know what happened to Esther, but I don't understand why. Please, I need to understand what drove you to such a desperate act." Martha stopped churning. Her back was still to him, but her body shook with silent, repressed emotion. "You can't understand, Mr. Vance. No outsider can. It was mercy." Mercy from what? Elias pressed. A fever. People survive fevers. Was it something else? Something chronic? She finally turned, her face streaked with tears that she quickly wiped away with the back of her calloused hand. Esther. She wasn't right, Mr. Vance, from the moment she was born. We kept it hidden. The shame, the isolation. She had fits. Not just fever, but terrible, violent fits. She would hurt herself. She'd hurt us. We couldn't leave her alone. Elias listened, the grim reality of the isolated life settling in. In the Ozarks of 1907, a child with severe mental or physical disabilities was a source of profound shame, a burden that could destroy a family's standing and resources. And it grew worse. Martha continued, her voice heavy with self-loathing. She was growing stronger, less manageable. The fits came daily. She was constantly in pain, and we were exhausted. We were broken. The fever was real, though, Elias clarified. Yes, it was the last straw. The doctor wasn't coming. We knew she was suffering, burning up. It was either watch her suffer a prolonged, agonizing death or end it quickly. End the pain. Mine and hers. Martha's confession was a torrent of raw human desperation, devoid of malice, fueled only by exhaustion and limited cruel options. And Silas agreed? He didn't agree, Martha whispered, glancing toward the door. He didn't stop me. He left the room. He let it happen. He loves his reputation more than anything. He did it to protect the family's name. This was the complete, agonizing truth. Not a random act of violence, but a desperate final solution to an impossible human dilemma, fueled by shame and isolation. As Martha struggled to regain her composure, Elias heard a sharp thud from Rebecca's corner. He turned. Rebecca was staring at him, her face no longer blank. It was a mask of terror and rage. She had understood the entire exchange. The fits, the pain, the end it quickly. She hadn't been lost in her own grief. She had been silently listening to her sister's terrible end being confessed. The doll lay on the floor. Rebecca was no longer whispering to it. She was staring at her mother, then at Elias, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. Then she did something truly unsettling. She crawled quickly, silently, toward the doll. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she began patting the floor around the doll, sweeping away small invisible specks of dust, her movements fast and frantic. Elias watched her, confused. "What is she doing, Mrs. Langley?" Martha looked at her daughter, her own face tightening with renewed fear. She does that sometimes. When she's agitated, she's always been sensitive. She cleans things, obsessively. But Rebecca wasn't just cleaning. She was sweeping toward a specific area of the floorboards, a dark, well-worn section near the hearth. Her manic energy was drawing attention to something hidden. She finally stopped, pointing a trembling, dirt-stained finger at a single, slightly raised floorboard. It was barely noticeable, obscured by soot and the passage of time. Rebecca then looked directly at Elias, her eyes communicating a chilling message. "Look here. Look at what they hid next." Elias moved toward the hearth, ignoring Martha's sharp, panicked intake of breath. He knelt and pressed down on the floorboard. It sank slightly. It was a small compartment, a crude, shallow hiding spot. "No, Mr. Vance, leave it be," Martha cried out, rushing forward to stop him. Elias ignored her. He forced his fingernails under the edge and lifted the board. The compartment was just large enough to contain a single folded item. He pulled it out. It was a piece of cheap, coarse burlap cloth, stiffened and stained. It was the same cloth mentioned in the blackmail photo, the cloth Martha used to end Esther's suffering. But tucked inside the folded burlap was something else. A small, water-stained, leather-bound journal. Elias looked at Martha, whose face was a picture of defeat. "What is this, Mrs. Langley? Another secret?" "It's Jedediah's," Martha admitted, her shoulders slumping. "He kept a journal. He was close to Esther. He was the one who was most troubled by everything. Silas was worried he'd write things down, speak the truth. We hid it to keep him safe from the law and from his own guilt. The journal was Jedediah's tormented record of the final months, perhaps the key to Elias's escape. Rebecca, the silent witness, had delivered the one thing the family feared more than the photograph itself: a written confession, the truth in black and white. Elias retreated to the small study, the heavy, water-stained leather journal clutched in his hands. He knew he didn't have much time. The discovery had pushed Martha to the brink, and Silas would return soon. The journal was Jedediah's desperate attempt to process the horror. The handwriting was neat at first, but grew progressively chaotic, smeared in places, as if the writer had been weeping or working by poor light. Elias began to read, plunging into the young man's descent into psychological torment. July 1907. The heat is terrible. Esther had a fit tonight. She screamed and threw Ma's prized vase against the wall. Pa strapped her arms down to the bed again. Ma cried. I went to the barn and cried with the horses. It's no life for a child. It's no life for any of us. Pa said we must endure. But the enduring is killing us all. The entries detailed the mounting pressure on the family, the increasing severity of Esther's condition, which Jedediah correctly identified as something more than just fits, but lacked the language to name, the total isolation of their homestead, and Silas's obsessive concern with reputation. August 1907. The shame is Pa's worst worry. We never take Esther to the settlement. We tell people she is delicate. They know, they always know. Pa prays over her, but his prayers are for himself. He prays for strength to keep the secret. He prays for Esther to just stop. The tension ratcheted up as the symptoms worsened. Early September 1907. Esther is dying, I think. She has a high fever, and the fits are constant. She thrashes and bites. Ma hasn't slept in 3 nights. Pa is quiet. He sits in the parlor, sharpening his knife. Not a word, not a threat, just the sound of the steel on the stone. It's worse than the yelling. Then came the entry about the first photographer, Titus Baines, confirming Silas's account of the blackmail, but adding a crucial detail. September 12th, 1907. The photographer, Baines. He took the picture. Then he did the awful thing. He set up another plate and caught Ma, caught her in the act of smothering the cloth over Esther's face. He knew, we all knew, it was a mercy, but a terrible, wicked one. When Ma saw the developed negative, she didn't deny it. She said she couldn't watch the suffering anymore. But Pa saw it as ruin. He saw the rope. Baines was no fool. He didn't want the coins. He wanted the farm. He left, but not before Pa took the axe from the woodshed. Pa wouldn't let me watch. But I heard the hooves running, and I heard Pa's screaming a long way off. Then silence. He came back hours later, covered in mud and a single ugly scratch on his cheek. He said Baines got away. But he was lying. He was shaking like a leaf. He only cares about the plate, the evidence. The journal confirmed Elias's darkest suspicion. Silas had murdered Baines to protect the family's name and his wife. He was not merely a conspirator. He was a killer. Elias turned the final smeared pages. Jedediah's last entry was chilling. October 1907. The new photographer is here. Vance. Pa's making him search for the plate. He won't let him leave. Pa says Vance is smart. He'll find it. Pa says if Vance knows the truth, then he is just as dangerous as Baines was. Ma is quiet. Rebecca is talking only to the doll. The house smells like dirt and lies. I can't be a part of this anymore. I saw Pa kill. I saw Ma kill. I am trapped. I am going to the barn. I will write no more. God help me. The date on the final entry was just yesterday. Elias slammed the journal shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. Jedediah had confessed everything, the murder of Esther, the murder of Baines, and his own intention to take his life. Elias now held a physical, undeniable record of 2 deaths and a confession of impending suicide. He had to act. He couldn't leave with Jedediah's potential body in the barn and his confession in hand without drawing the full, lethal wrath of Silas. He quickly pocketed the journal. He had to find Jedediah, to stop him, and to use the family's own psychological turmoil against Silas. Elias ran to the kitchen. Martha was gone. He heard the door slam outside. Silas was back. He ran to the back door, slipping out onto the porch just as Silas entered the front parlor. He raced toward the barn, a dark, looming structure nestled at the edge of the clearing. The air was heavy, the impending storm visible in the bruised purple of the horizon. Elias flung the barn door open. The interior was dark and filled with the stale smell of hay and animal dung. "Jedediah, Jedediah, where are you?" Elias called out, his voice hoarse. He heard a faint, desperate cough from the loft. Elias scrambled up the ladder, his boots slipping on the dusty rungs. He found Jedediah huddled in the corner, clutching a coil of rope, tears streaming down his face. He was alive, but barely. He was shaking violently, his eyes red and swollen. "The journal," Jedediah whispered, spotting Elias. "You found it. You read it. You know." "Yes, I know everything," Elias said, his voice urgent. "But we have to go, Jedediah. Now. Silas is back. We can use this journal to clear your name, to expose them, but we have to move." Jedediah shook his head, a sound of utter defeat. "No. I can't leave. I can't tell the world what Ma did. I can't let them hang her. I'll stay. I'll take the shame with me." Just then, a booming voice echoed from the barn floor. "Vance, where are you? Get down here, you lying snake." Silas Langley had found them. Elias knew the axe was probably near. Silas was coming up the ladder. The hunter was now the hunted, trapped in the dusty loft with a man who had given up on life. The heavy sound of Silas's boots on the wooden rungs sent a spike of pure adrenaline through Elias. He had seconds. "Jedediah, listen to me," Elias hissed, grabbing the young man's arm. "You won't be helping your mother by dying. You'll only be clearing the path for Silas to frame me and claim that I drove you to it. You are the only person who can stop him. You are the only person who can tell the truth about your father." "I can't," Jedediah pleaded, pulling away. The shame will kill us all." The top of Silas's head appeared above the loft floor. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His hand gripped the heavy, familiar handle of the axe. "Jedediah, step away from the photographer," Silas ordered, his voice dangerously calm. "He's a liar. He twists the truth to suit his greed, just like Baines." Elias stood between Silas and Jedediah. "I have the journal, Silas. Jedediah's confession. The full account of Esther's murder and Baines's murder. It details everything, including the specific spot by the creek where you dragged his body before you thought better of it." Silas froze, his eyes widening slightly, the only outward sign of his shock. "A desperate lie, Vance. A fake. You think I'm stupid?" "It's not a lie," Elias pressed, pulling the worn leather journal from his pocket. He flipped it open. "Jedediah, tell him what you wrote. Tell him about the single ugly scratch on his cheek when he returned from killing Baines." Jedediah, though terrified, looked up at his father, the raw pain in his eyes a more potent weapon than any axe. "I saw it, Pa, on your jaw, from the briars near the creek. You said Baines got away, but you were lying. You killed him." The mention of the scratch, a detail Elias had only read moments before, was the proof. It wasn't a lie. It was an accurate, verifiable detail that confirmed Jedediah's account. Silas's control snapped. He lunged, swinging the axe in a wide, desperate arc. Elias ducked, the wind of the blade passing inches from his head. The axe handle slammed into the wooden wall with a sickening thwack. "You will not leave this barn alive," Silas roared, scrambling to pull the embedded axe free. Elias had to buy time. He grabbed a handful of hay and threw it directly into Silas's face. Blinded and momentarily disoriented, Silas stumbled back. Elias seized the moment, pushing Jedediah ahead of him and down the ladder. "Go, run to the woods, I'll hold him," Elias yelled, but Jedediah, paralyzed by years of obedience and fear, froze at the barn door. Silas ripped the hay from his eyes, his breathing ragged. He saw Jedediah frozen at the door and Elias standing by the loft opening. "You will not shame your mother, boy," Silas screamed, his paternal desperation overriding his murderous rage. Elias knew the only way out was to shatter the family's code of silence, not with threats, but with the consequences of their actions. He spotted the old rusted branding iron hanging from a beam near the loft opening. He grabbed it, hefting its cold weight. "You wanted to protect the family name, Silas?" Elias yelled down. "You murdered a blackmailer and let your wife commit a desperate act of murder by mercy. You covered it up with the silence of the soil. But what about Rebecca?" Silas paused, his eyes narrowing. "Rebecca has nothing to do with this." "She knows, Silas. She showed me the journal. She cleans the spot where her mother hid the evidence. She's reenacting the murder with her doll. You haven't protected your family. You've poisoned them. Your secret has turned one son into a suicidal witness and one daughter into a mad recluse." This revelation, the destruction of his self-justifying lie that he was protecting his family, hit Silas like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his grip on the axe loosening. Elias knew the moment of hesitation was all he would get. He ran along the loft, leapt onto a protruding beam, and swung toward the barn window, smashing through the brittle glass and wood frame with a deafening crash. He hit the ground hard outside, the wooden splinters stinging his skin. The leather journal still clutched tight. He looked back. Silas was screaming, his attention divided between his shattered worldview and the two escapees. Jedediah, seeing his chance, finally bolted and ran into the woods. Elias didn't stop to see which direction Silas would choose. He mounted his horse, which was tied near the side of the barn, and spurred it into a frantic, headlong gallop down the path, heading toward the only thing that mattered, the nearest settlement, the location of the sheriff, and the end of the Langley horror. He had escaped, but the terrifying story of the Ozark homestead was far from over. He had to deliver the proof. If you've made it this far, the suspense is about to break. You're witnessing a real-life horror story that actually happened in the quiet corners of America. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and smash the like button. What do you think will happen when Elias presents the journal to the sheriff? Will Silas catch up to Jedediah? Leave your predictions in the comments and stay tuned for the next chapter. Elias rode through the thickening twilight, his horse pounding through the rough, unforgiving terrain. The cold air whipped his face, but the adrenaline masked the pain of the impact from the barn window. The leather journal was still tightly secured in his coat pocket, the weight of it a terrifying but necessary burden. It was the only barrier between him and the murderous acts of Silas Langley. He had roughly 20 miles to cover to reach Lebanon, the nearest town with a functioning sheriff's office and a telegraph line. The path was treacherous, a winding, rocky track that followed the river, perfect for an ambush. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly. The landscape was vast and silent, the kind of silence that suggests a hidden observer. Silas was undoubtedly in pursuit. Elias knew the man was desperate and an expert woodsman. He couldn't afford a moment's rest. As he plunged into a particularly dense patch of forest, Elias heard a sound that chilled him to the bone. The rapid, uneven beat of a second set of hooves gaining ground behind him. Silas was on a faster horse. Elias pushed his own mount harder, urging it over the uneven ground. He knew he couldn't outrun a determined killer on superior terrain for long. He had to use the one advantage he had, his mind and the element of surprise. He came upon a narrow ravine, a steep drop-off where a small tributary fed into the main river. He had noticed it on the ride up. The path was barely wide enough for a single horse, forcing anyone passing through to slow down considerably. Elias reined in his horse, forcing it to slide to a halt just before the ravine. He dismounted, his legs shaking with fatigue. He quickly pulled the horse's bridle, leading it down a hidden, steeper path that angled toward the riverbed below the main trail. He then found a large, dead pine branch, a good 6 feet long and heavy. He used the branch to meticulously rake the ground, smoothing the disturbed dirt of his horse's hoofprints just before the ravine. He made it look as if he had continued straight along the path, which was now obscured by the sudden steep drop. He then scrambled back up to the main trail, took the pine branch and wedged it under a large moss-covered rock near the ravine edge, pulling it back sharply. The movement was enough to cause a small but significant landslide of loose dirt and small stones down the bank. He then retreated to his hiding spot down by the river. Elias and his horse stood motionless beneath the cover of the brush, listening. The sounds of Silas's pursuit grew louder, closer. Silas's horse burst into the clearing. Elias could hear the heavy, ragged breathing of the animal. Silas pulled his horse up short, his eyes scanning the trail. "Vance!" Silas bellowed into the empty woods. "It's no use. Give me the journal. I'll give you a chance to walk away." Silas saw the disturbed ground, the fresh slide of dirt, and the apparent absence of hoofprints continuing along the path. He drew the grim, logical conclusion. Elias had gone over the edge, or his horse had slipped, perhaps to his death. Silas dismounted quickly, walking cautiously to the edge. He peered down the steep bank. The sight of the disturbed earth, the fallen debris, and the sheer drop convinced him. He wouldn't risk the drop himself, not with the night coming on. He needed to find the journal, not the body. He turned and began to search the area near the ravine, looking for a sign of the leather-bound book, believing it might have been dropped in the struggle or fall. This was Elias's chance. He gently eased his horse out from the brush. He remounted in the oppressive silence, and then, with a sudden fierce cry, he spurred the horse out onto the main path behind Silas. Silas heard the pounding hooves and spun around, the axe still clutched in his hand. He stared in bewildered rage as Elias thundered past him, already 24 yards down the road toward Lebanon. "Vance!" Silas screamed, a raw, defeated cry that echoed in the hills. The element of surprise had worked. Silas was a few seconds behind, but those few seconds were vital. Elias risked a look back. Silas was scrambling onto his horse, his face contorted with a terrible, desperate hatred. The pursuit was on again. Elias rode for another hour in a desperate, silent race. The trees finally began to thin, and he saw the faint, comforting glow of distant lights. Lebanon. He rode his exhausted horse into the outskirts of the town. The sight of a kerosene street lamp, a few clustered storefronts, and a recognizable civilization brought an overwhelming wave of relief. He pulled up at the first building with a visible official sign, Sheriff's Office. He stumbled from the saddle, his body aching and hammered on the wooden door. A gruff voice from inside called out. The door opened to reveal a stout, bewildered man in a simple uniform holding a cup of coffee. "What in the blazes?" the sheriff began. "My name is Elias Vance," Elias gasped, clutching his chest. "I'm a photographer. I've come from the Ozarks. I have evidence of 2 murders and an attempted suicide. The killer is Silas Langley. He is armed with an axe and he is right behind me. Look." Elias pointed back down the road. In the distance, a rapidly approaching shadow on horseback could be seen, riding without regard for speed or danger. The sheriff, a man named Barnett, saw the truth in the photographer's terrified, desperate eyes. He took one look at the approaching rider, drew the heavy revolver from his holster, and yelled back into the office. "Ben, get the shotgun! We've got company! And lock the back door!" Elias leaned against the doorframe, pulling the water-stained journal from his pocket. He had made it. The truth was finally in the light. The psychological nightmare was over, But the final, violent confrontation was about to begin. Sheriff Barnett, a veteran lawman with a weathered face, wasted no time. He shoved Elias inside the small, cluttered office and slammed the heavy wooden door shut, locking the bolt with a loud, definitive clank. "Stay down, son," Barnett ordered, taking position by the window, the barrel of his revolver resting on the sill. "Deputy Ben, the back room now." The deputy, a young man who looked pale and shaken, scrambled to obey. Elias, breathing heavily, knelt behind the heavy oak desk, placing the journal safely beneath a stack of documents. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice strained, "he's after this journal. It details everything. The death of his daughter, the murder of a previous photographer, Titus Baines, and the confession of his son, Jedediah." "We'll worry about the paper later," Barnett said, his eyes fixed on the window. "Right now, we worry about the man." Silas Langley burst into view, riding his horse right up to the front porch of the office. He slid from the saddle, the axe held high, the face of a man driven past the point of reason. He was no longer a desperate father. He was a cornered animal. "Vance, give me the book!" Silas roared, the sound echoing through the small town square. "Silas Langley!" The sheriff's voice boomed from the window. "Drop the weapon and surrender. You're under arrest for the murder of Titus Baines." Silas hesitated, the mention of the crime confirming his worst fears. His secret had escaped the Ozarks. He stared at the barred window, the axe handle slick in his sweating grip. "You can't prove a thing," Silas screamed. "It's all a lie. He's a blackmailer, a liar, just like the other one." "We have a witness, Silas," Barnett countered. "Drop the axe. The house is surrounded." Barnett was lying. The town was asleep, and there was only one deputy. But the desperate lie was enough to sow doubt in Silas's tormented mind. Silas took a desperate, charging step toward the door, raising the axe. He intended to break the lock and retrieve the evidence. "Last warning, Silas!" The crack of the sheriff's revolver was deafening in the small office. The bullet struck the wooden frame just inches from Silas's head, kicking up a spray of splinters. The near miss stunned Silas. He stopped, his focus shifting from the door to the window, the adrenaline fading to stark terror. He realized he was no longer operating in the isolated safety of his homestead. He was in the domain of the law, and he was alone. He looked around. The street was empty, but he could feel the eyes of the town on him. The shame he had fought so hard to avoid had finally arrived, magnified under the harsh kerosene lamps of Lebanon. With a final broken cry of rage and defeat, Silas turned and bolted. He ran back to his horse, grabbed the reins, and galloped out of the square, disappearing back down the dark road toward the Ozarks. Barnett watched him go, then lowered his gun. "Fool. Thinks he can outrun the wire." He looked at Elias. "All right, Vance, now you talk. Start with the book and tell me about this son of his." Elias quickly recounted the entire horrifying ordeal. The post-mortem commission, the blackmail photo of the smothering, the murder of Baines, the discovery of Jedediah's journal, and the boy's flight into the woods. Sheriff Barnett read the journal, his expression grim. The raw honesty of Jedediah's account, the agony of watching his sister suffer, the shame driving his father, the final desperate act of violence, was irrefutable. "This is all the proof we need," Barnett declared, slapping the journal shut. "We'll send the wire to the surrounding counties and get a posse ready by sunup. We'll find Silas. We have to find the boy, too. He's a witness, but he's also in grave danger from his own despair." Elias was exhausted, but a terrible realization dawned on him. They had the evidence, they had the killer on the run, but they were missing a vital piece of the human puzzle. "Sheriff," Elias said, standing up, his body stiff. "What about Martha and Rebecca? They are still there, the killer's wife and his traumatized daughter. They are alone in that house." Barnett nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "If the journal is true, Martha Langley is a murderer as well, but she's also a victim of isolation and desperation. And the girl, She's a child. We'll send a dispatch rider back to the house at first light. We'll secure them and we'll bring them in. But the chase for Silas and the search for the boy must come first. Elias knew his own part in the nightmare was nearly over. He had escaped, he had exposed the truth, and the machinery of justice was now in motion. He had walked into the deep woods to photograph a lie, and he was leaving with the full macabre story of a family destroyed by shame, secrecy, and the brutal psychological weight of the Ozark isolation. The search began before sunrise. Sheriff Barnett, Elias, and a small, armed posse rode back toward the Langley homestead. The air was charged with a heavy finality. Elias, no longer a captive photographer, was now a key witness, a reluctant guide through the landscape of the Langley's terror. They didn't find Silas. He was an expert at disappearing into the mountains he knew intimately. The search was expanded, the telegraph wires humming with his name. But they did find the second missing piece, Jedediah. The young man was found near a shallow cave, huddled and shivering, half frozen and exhausted, but alive. He had dropped the rope and run until he collapsed. The sight of his father's final desperate act in the barn, combined with Elias's plea, had broken his resolve to die. He surrendered immediately to the posse, relieved to be under the protection of the law. Jedediah confirmed every word in his journal. His testimony, combined with the written record, solidified the case. The murder of Esther was an act of exhausted, desperate mercy. The murder of Titus Baines was an act of brutal, panicked self-preservation. As the posse secured Jedediah, Elias led a small group back to the house. The windows were dark. An unnatural stillness hung over the property, a deep, pervasive quiet that felt colder than death itself. They entered the house cautiously. It was empty. The parlor, where Elias had first encountered the stiff tableau of the family, was untouched. The cot where Esther had lain was gone. The smell of pine and dried herbs still lingered, but the metallic tang of death and fear had dissipated. They searched the kitchen and the bedrooms. No sign of Martha or Rebecca. In the small, sunless room where Rebecca had spent her days, Elias noticed something lying on the floor. It was the doll. The doll was sitting upright, facing the corner of the room, as if in time out. On its lap lay a perfectly folded clean square of burlap, the same material used to suffocate Esther. It was a final, silent, psychological record of the murder, left by the only living witness who couldn't speak. They found a note tucked beneath the doll. It was written in Martha's elegant, steady script, addressed simply, "To the law." The note was brief, a final testament of a woman who had reached the end of her endurance. "I do not ask for forgiveness. The shame is a heavier cage than any you can build. Esther is at peace, and so am I. The burden is lifted. Let my husband be judged by his own conscience. The true history is written in the soil and in the minds of those who witnessed it. Do not look for us. We are gone to endure our truth alone." Martha and Rebecca had vanished into the mountains, choosing the isolation and anonymity of the hills over the public shame of a trial. It was a final, desperate act of control, a refusal to let the state fully process their personal horror. They hadn't run to escape justice, but to escape exposure. The authorities searched the area for days. Silas Langley was never found. He became a legend in the Ozark Hills, the desperate man who murdered a photographer and his own child to protect his name, only to vanish forever into the wilderness he had sworn to master. Many years later, a weathered axe was found embedded deep in the trunk of an ancient oak tree, but the identity of the remains found nearby was inconclusive. Elias Vance returned to St. Louis, his world changed forever. He sold his camera and his glass plates. He never took another post-mortem photograph. The memory of the Langleys, the truth hidden in the lens, and the haunting, vacant gaze of Rebecca, who used a doll to witness a murder, was his final, indelible print. The only physical proof of the entire horrific affair that remained outside the annals of the law was Jedediah's journal. It remained with Elias for a time, a grim, leather-bound record of a family's descent. The story was never published in the sensational papers of the time. Elias ensured that. The truth was too complex, too human, and too rooted in the brutal, psychological desperation of isolation to be reduced to a lurid headline. He carried the full, unvarnished truth, the knowledge that the greatest horrors are often hidden not by ghosts or magic, but by the desperate, flawed choices of ordinary people under immense pressure. The terrible story of the Macabre Langley family and the post-mortem photo they hid became a silent warning, a testament to the shadows that exist not in another dimension, but in the deepest, most isolated corners of the human heart.